From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. I'm your host, Remco Tanis. Japan is nervous, says today's guest, Tokyo native Yuki Tatsumi, who is now a senior fellow, co-chair of the East Asia program, and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Nervous about, as she calls it, China's sustained aggressiveness. Nervous the many skirmishes taking place in the region from Taiwan and the South China Sea to the Himalayas could quickly escalate into something way more serious. And so Japan is beefing up its security and defense policies. In this episode, Yuki and I talk about what that actually looks like, how this rhymes with Japan's pacifist constitution, which for now still denounces war and violence as a means to solve international problems, and if there are still avenues open where engaging with China works better than deterring the superpower next door. Yuki Tatsumi, welcome to State of Asia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I first wanted to look back a little bit with you. Japan had a long policy of liberal deterrence towards China. It was created way back in the 70s when China's position on the world stage was nothing compared to what it is now, of course. I was wondering, with this liberal deterrence policy, Tokyo wanted to make Beijing aware of the advantages of working together, especially economically, while at the same time making it clear that what the cost would be if China were ever to become aggressive towards Japan. Very open question. How successful was Japan's approach over the past 50 years or so?
That is a great question. When Japan first normalized its diplomatic relations with China, like you said, back in 1970s, it did have their own rendition of responsible stakeholder policy, if you will. So Japan's engagement with China will be primarily economic, just like Japan's approach toward many of the countries in Asia back then, which is really based on the economic assistance and more like economic engagement. But by extension, just like Japan's approach towards Southeast Asia was, Japan's hope for Japan-China relation was that as China's economy grows and people get more affluent and starts enjoying the product of economic prosperity, I think Japan did have a hope that would also lead to more open society for China, less ideologically divided, certainly not military aggressive. But I think if we look at China today, I have to say that I think that liberal deterrent policy really has not worked. And that's not just by Japan, I would argue. I think United States for the longest time, until just literally a few years ago, had a similar approach to China. But so far, I think US, Japan, and I think rest of the world really tried that approach. They really focus on engaging China, and hopefully that'll groom them into a responsible major power. But I don't think it has turned out that way.
If we look now 50 years later, Japan has a completely new sort of neighbor in China, no longer a poor nation licking its wounds from internal struggles, but an economic, geopolitical, and military superpower that outshines Japan in any number of metrics at the moment. Last month, Japan released its annual diplomatic Blue Book, which is a report on the country's foreign policy. In it, Tokyo stated it wants to pursue a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interest with China. That's a reference that apparently had been absent in Japan's messaging for 5 years. However, the Blue Book also accuses China of unilaterally changing the status quo in the East and South China Seas and of continuing to strengthen its military activities around Japan, making Japan's security environment the most severe and complex since World War II, according to the Blue Book. Beijing, no surprise there, expressed its firm objection to the Japanese Blue Book, with Foreign Ministry spokesman Jin Lian saying that Japan had resorted to the same old false accusations against China and the hype of China threat. What I was wondering is, with relations between China and Japan at the moment at a low, is Japan sending out mixed signals to China, and is the balance between engaging and deterring China, has that gone out of whack with deterrence taking the overhand?
Japan definitely shifted its focus on deterring China from engaging China. But at the same time, because of Japan's geographical location, like you mentioned, Japan and China will remain neighbor, geographically speaking. And China has already surpassed Japan in, economic indicator. It is definitely outspending Japan in terms of defense budget, and the population side is far bigger. So we have a very different landscape here. But because of that geographical proximity, even if Japan's policy shifted toward deterrence, and at the moment or last few years, I think it prioritizes more deterrence aspect as opposed to engagement, it doesn't at the same time really completely cut off the diplomatic ties with China. There are still efforts that are being made, not just by Japan, but in the framework of Japan, South Korea, China triangle to maintain that engagement window. But I think the criticism from Chinese foreign ministry is no surprise. But I would also flip back the coin to China and say, see what you're doing. You're bullying all the countries in the neighborhood that you claim to have a territorial dispute with because you're bigger. And your foreign minister at one point said in Shangri-La, we're a bigger power, so the rest of you, the smaller country, you just have to, go follow our lead. How is that balancing with Chinese claiming that we're still developing country and our intention is peaceful? So I would just flip that coin back right in face of China.
China and Japan, China and other countries in the region are at odds over a range of issues. You also mentioned the ties still between China and Japan because they are geographical neighbors. China remains Japan's biggest trading partner. Last year, a total of 318 billion US dollars. So highly intertwined economies. What options does Japan have to still increase engagement to somehow maybe that way show China that maintaining the status quo is best for everyone involved?
So I think for Japan's perspective, I think sustaining the level of economic engagement is one, but then also shifting the focus away from controversial issues. So basically focusing more on cultural ties. We often talk about panda diplomacy, student exchanges. That certainly would be another avenue to sustain engagement. And another engagement is, again, stepping away from those, less controversial area that tends to reside on more political, military, security realm, but then more on issues like public health, climate policy, and things like that, and try to increase the dialogue in that realm. But here, I think what is increasingly concerning Japanese is that Chinese seeming increasing grip on the surveilling the what's going on inside the country, including surveilling not just its own people's movement, but then all the visitors' movement, and that is a great concern of Japan, because Japan certainly doesn't want to have to deal with a situation where China starts doing what Russia often does to its Western visitors, which is basically randomly arresting these private citizens with the unfounded ground of espionage or suspicious activities or illegal activities, according to their book. That will be one concern that Japan has if it wants to shift focus of engagement more toward people to people exchange, cultural ties, and continued economic exchange.
Japan would try to engage more on those in those fields even more than it has done, maybe as counterweight to the deterrence. Doesn't sound like that's a priority for the Japanese government at the moment, given Prime Minister Kishida's speech to the U.S. Congress in April, where he again was pretty firm on China, saying things like China's military actions present an unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge to not only Japan but the world at large. Kishida echoed statements made by the NATO Secretary General about a conflict between authoritarian and democratic states. And he even said Ukraine of today may be East Asia of tomorrow. Is that a reflection of how nervous Kishida and with him Japan is, maybe about actual war coming to East Asia if things keep going down the road they're on now?
I think there is a general concern, not just Kishida. This concern has been held pretty much across the political spectrum. The way that Japan is increasingly nervous about saber rattling that the China is showing vis-a-vis Taiwan. And again, I talk about geography. Taiwan is literally only a couple of hours away from Japan's southwesternmost island. If some, crisis situation happens across Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and mainland China, it can quickly escalate into some very serious situation that affects Japan's own security. So Japan is definitely sounding alarm on that one. That is certainly, primarily that is a reflection of that sense of crisis. And then also, even in South China Sea, for example, if something serious happens between China and one of the claimants of their territorial dispute down that realm, very important shipping lanes will be exposed to great danger, and which Japan very much relies on for its imports from all sorts of goods, across the globe. So it is really a reflection of their nervousness about how this China's sustained aggressiveness, both in rhetoric and what they do. Although many of that they don't doesn't take a military force, it's sometimes very aggressive coast guard, very aggressive fishermen, very aggressive, maritime research vessels. How that could kind of escalate into something way more serious, and because everybody's in such a close quarter over there, and one of the problem is that if something happens on while they're on the sea or even at airspace, it is really hard to get a truly objective account of what actually happened and who started first. And it will be forever case of, he said, she said. But if something like that happens, because everybody's so close from each other, it will escalate very quickly. So these past a few sentiment that's been expressed by Kishida and others in Japan is really reflection of that.
You mentioned Taiwan. You mentioned the skirmishes in the waters of the East China Sea, the South China Sea. We are reading a lot about, hearing a lot about, and even seeing a lot about what's happening with the Philippines, of course. Japan has an interesting position there. Its constitution still says it is not seeing violence as a means to solving international conflict. Its armed forces are named the Self Defense Forces for a reason. Yet it also has this treaty with the US that the US will aid Japan if it were necessary militarily. In return, the US is allowed to use bases on Japanese territory. The US also has similar treaties with Taiwan, with the Philippines. Is Japan able to stay on the side if the US were to be called in militarily to aid Taiwan or the Philippines? Or has that ship sailed for Japan?
Based on the current bilateral security treaty, one side of the ledger is yes, U.S. would support Japan defend its own territory if an invasion happens. The other side of the ledger is what you said in the regional conflict. U.S. upon consultation, U.S. is allowed to use Japanese bases and facilities, but then also Japan's self-defense force will provide logistical support, so non-combatant support at the back end for the US military operations. And in reality, if it's anything regional, whether that may be Korean Peninsula or Taiwan, or God forbid something happens in the Philippines, most of the forces will be funneling through the bases across Japan. So you might want to say that, regardless of Japan's own preference, once, US were called to come to defend those partners. And Philippines is a more straightforward case. It's a treaty ally. Taiwan's a little bit more complicated because it's not exactly a treaty. It is the Taiwan Relations Act, which is Americans' domestic law, which kind of, sets the parameter of when U.S. can come to Taiwan's aid, or when, and some other circumstances that U.S. may have a second thought. For example, unilateral declaration of independence done by Taiwan or something like that, right? But in both cases, it is Japan will be inevitably asked to, at minimum, support the U.S. forces operation on the logistical side. In Taiwan's case, though, you hear some political leaders, like late Prime Minister Abe once hinted that. Vice Prime Minister Aso had said that. Former Defense Minister Kishi had mentioned this in past in a kind of indirect terms. But then there are more, just because of the geographical proximity, there are widely spreading sense amongst Japanese political leaders that Taiwan contingency would be Japan's own defense crisis, because it is just so easy to bleed things over. And if that happens, then it's no longer Japan's self-defense force supporting U.S. operations, help defending Taiwan. It is really about Japan defending its own territory, so that while that operation is going on across the strait, that vulnerability is not taken advantage of. In either way, I think Japan's self-defense forces will be involved. I think that is very much the consultation is going between the two governments at the moment.
You also hear voices saying maybe Japan should take some space from the US, just keep true to its role as a East Asian middle power, a constructive bridge builder, and not as, for example, China sees it, just move closer and closer to the US. What is the impact of Japan's changing security policies on intra-East Asian stability? And do other countries in the region outside of China see Japan as a potential stabilizer in East Asia?
I think that is very increasingly the way that rest of the Asia sees it, minus China, like you mentioned. Not only that, I think a lot of countries in Indo-Pacific sees Japan as a very kind of important connective node between them and ensuring the American involvement in the region. A few years ago, U.S.-Philippines relations, for example, were a little bit on a rough patch because of the severe policy differences over human rights between then President Obama and President Duterte. But Prime Minister Abe was able to form very good, personal relationship with Duterte. So even when Philippine U.S. ties were a little bit strained, Japan was right in the middle, still was able to facilitate that communication. So I think that is the kind of the role that the region sees, and I think that really came to the fore when 8 years ago, when we saw the President Trump coming into the office. 3 days after he got into the office, he withdrew U.S. from the TPP, which President Obama and with his predecessor and Prime Minister Abe worked so hard to put together. And everybody was, kind of there was a concern that what's going to happen to this multilateral trade negotiations. And Japan kind of stood firm and basically kept everybody but the US together. And we have CPTPP now. So I think that is increasing the role that Japan is playing, and I think somewhat is expected to play.
Want to just briefly step aside with the relation Japan has with South Korea?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important one.
I don't know what the latest status is, but at least last year it seemed better than ever since World War II, pretty much. How do these two countries see each other in also the security background of the region?
That's also intricately linked with how South Korea see China. Does it see it more as a security concern, or does it look at it more as the trade partner? And then I think before the current president, President Young, I think the previous administration in Seoul really more look at the PRC as more country to engage. But I think one of the major policy shifts that happened after President Yoon came in was that one of his priority, he said it from the outset that he will reset, if you will, Seoul's relationship with Tokyo and put it back on the track again to a more future oriented, constructive, more partnership course. And I think President Yoon really stayed with that. And I think by seeing him standing firm, sometimes really at his own domestic support rate, on some of these very difficult historical issues between the two countries, I think Japan began to reciprocate. And you see that really kind of unfolded last year when President Yoon basically took the responsibility to solve this Korean forced labor issue during World War II into his own government's hand and said, this is, we will solve this by establishing fund. We will still invite Japanese corporation to contribute to this fund, but it is primarily South Korean government's job to do. And then he took a lot of flack for that, on both sides within Korea, because that was really not a politically popular decision. But he stood firm with it. So I think by seeing him that Japan reciprocated by Prime Minister Kishida invited President Yoon to a summit in Hiroshima. He and President Yoon together visited memorial in Hiroshima that pay respect to the Korean residents that were also perished under atomic bomb back in World War II. And then I think that was almost like a full cycle in terms symbolically, the cycle of reconciliation. So Japan Korea relations are really back on track into the more positive course. But then I think background of that is really both countries' perception toward China and approaches toward China is really converging from the ones that were more, focused on engagement to more focused on deterrent. It took a lot for South Korea to make that shift. That also reflects the sense of this current administration's sense of concern toward the, Beijing's behavior.
Japan's foreign minister Yoko Kamikawa recently visited Nepal and Sri Lanka. That big country in between those two, India. What is the relations Delhi and Tokyo share at the moment?
So Japan and India, Japan's support within Japan toward the closer partnership with India has always been there. Japan always considered India as friendly major power. I think it's the same, very similar thing is happening on India-Japan front too. Obviously, Japan-India relationship, very much focused on, started from more, economic development focus, people-to-people exchange focus. But here again, Japan and India's perception toward China is again converging and more toward the sounding alarm direction. India and China, they already have a land border where they have open skirmishes every now and then. So that's already not a great news to begin with. And then India increasingly is really not keen on China's behavior in their Indian Ocean area either. So I think that's really bringing, again, two countries together. And its actual relationship is more complicated than that. There's, economic relations, but then India's economy has its own issues. But I think for the moment, like Japan's relations with South Korea, Japan's relationship India is kind of converging in the way that we're seeing right now as more of a security partner because their perception toward the Beijing is converging.
I don't mean to tick off a list of all countries in the world and Japan with you, but just one more, if I may, because in that same visit that Japanese Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa made to Sri Lanka and Nepal, she also went to Africa, but she also made one stop in Europe, namely in Paris, and that was just days before Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, went to Paris. So, what is it about France that it attracts these senior Asian leaders and the rest of Europe seemingly doesn't?
I think for Japan's perspective, Japan and France has certain, institutionalized security partnership, which I think Japan would like to reinforce. That's really coming down to it. And then also, I think Japan looks at France and President Macron, as one of the stronger leader that are not necessarily taking those, some of the extremist, like more authoritarian views that seem to be held by some emerging leaders in Europe. I mean, we always talk about this is year of election everywhere, but especially in Europe. And there are definitely a concern that the more populist, for the lack of a better word, but since I'm in DC, I'm just going to say it, more Trump-like political leader emerging across Europe. There's definitely a concern about that. And then I think President Macron is one of the few leaders that are kind of standing still firm, that are like clearly not. So I think there's definitely a part of that making a stop there.
The late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe famously, in the last decade, started the process of adjusting Japan's constitution, the Article 9 of the constitution, which says Japan renounces war and use of force as means of settling international disputes. I understand many Japanese people feel strong attachment to the constitution's peaceful ideals. Then, late 2022, the Japanese government announcing a significant rise in military spending. The target is doubling it by 2027. That is something that has to be paid by the Japanese taxpayers, of course. Can you talk a little bit about the sentiment of Japanese people? Do they feel the changing of the security situation in the region legitimizes these steps, or are they still very hesitant and would they kind of in denial maybe prefer to keep things the way they were?
I do think that there is a more widespread understanding and awareness among Japanese public that situation, not just in the immediate neighborhood in Japan, but then worldwide is really changing, and we're seeing the situation where we never thought, Japanese public never thought that it would see before. What really kept it was actually remarkable when Japanese government came out with this new or updated security strategy, defense strategy, and a build-up plan. And one of the hallmark was, like you said, bringing the defense spending up to a double. By the way, talking about double, we're still talking about like slightly below NATO standard. So let's not get crazy here. so, so I would just say that outset,
I heard someone say doubling the budget would finally restock the armed forces with the munition they need and everything. It's not like an expansion of what they have.
No. So basically, I kept arguing for a long time that Japan has actually went through a, lost decade, almost 2 decade. This correlates with their, economy too, that as their economy stagnated, Japan obviously kept its defense spending level in terms of the percentage of the GDP wise, but because the total pie is shrinking, that means Japan was spending less on defense. While that was really coincided with a period where Chinese military spending starts skyrocketing. So I think right now China outspends Japan by like 200%, 150%. I haven't seen the latest stats, but and then their military spending figures never quite transparent anyway. Japan is really recovering from that lost decade or two, and like I said, Japan's traditional defense spending was 1% of just GDP or slightly below, so it's like 0.99, 0.98. So doubling that still will bring it to 1.98, 2 point compared to countries like United States, which basically spends like 4% of its GDP and doesn't think it's still doesn't think it's spending enough. That's kind of one frame of mindset that I think we have to keep in mind when when we talk about doubling. But at the same time, there was definitely a significantly less pushback from Japanese public when late Prime Minister Abe, when he was a prime minister, when he kind of modernized the defense and security legislation back in 2015. there was a mass protest. If I'm sure you remember the image of public surrounding the Diet building and protesting, and some of the opposition leader came to protest with them. None of that happened this time around. And I think I attribute that great deal to their increasing sense of kind of insecurity, not just about China, but then when government was really deliberating that and the media reporting on those, like which direction it might go, Japanese public was seeing Russian invasion of Ukraine on TV every day. That really made them more understanding about Japan's, government needs to increase defense spending. But like you said, Japanese public by and large, I think, continues to have a very strong sense of attachment and almost like a strong sense of identity in it. In the first part of that Article 9 that you mentioned about, which is, Japan will never be the first one to punch, to put it simply. There's definitely a strong sense of attachment to that as a kind of a national ethos, national ethos as a country. But yeah, we're not gonna punch first. But if you try to punch us, we will be definitely prepared to punch you back. Is I think where Japan is at the moment.
I remember, I don't know exactly how long ago it was, 10, 12 years ago, I was in Beijing during, crisis is too big of a word, but there were some skerfuffles around the Senkaku Islands between Beijing and Japan. And the anti-Japanese sentiment in China was fed with great vigor, with banners on the streets and everything, denouncing Japan, and everything that is Japanese. Japanese products were boycotted. What is the sentiment currently among Japanese people towards China, Chinese people? So not the government, but more, we talked at the beginning of our conversation about the possibility of increasing engagement. You would need people to be prepared to go to China or for study or for work. Or is that preparedness still there? Is that willingness still there, or are people turning away from that?
Japanese at public level remains very curious about China. I think there definitely still a desire to learn, Chinese or Chinese culture. But I think what is really hurting is Beijing restricting these people movement, and that includes Chinese scholar visiting Japan too. It's so much more laborious for them to try to get a visa to come out or government's approval to travel. What that has been doing is people in Japan really have fewer and fewer opportunity to hear directly from, Chinese scholars, Chinese students, and that really hurts their, willingness to visit China. And then, they keep hearing about Chinese government oppressing like dissidents and, arresting dissidents. They're getting exposed to the news media about, China has this overseas police location that polices its own people that are outside China. Those doesn't necessarily turn them against China, non-Chinese people, but it definitely raises level of concern about, visiting China. Because I can say for my colleagues in Japan who's a China scholar, there's a greater sense of anxiety whenever they visit China. Like, they always try to make sure that they are a part of this organized visiting group for like a specific conference. And for those, who used to extend their stay and, meet their friends or whatever, they no longer do that. They stick with that official schedule and come back. And that is because of the concern that people are getting arrested. That's really hurting.
And that decline in people-to-people contact, of course, doesn't help bringing back a balance between deterrence and engagement.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yuki Tatsumi, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I'm joined by my colleagues Serena Jung and Manuela Caldesina. Welcome both.
Hi. Hello.
The last question in my conversation with Yuki, I asked her whether people in Japan, what their attitude is toward people in China, and so not as much government to government. And then later I heard a conversation that our colleagues of Asia Society Japan hosted, also on Japan's foreign policy, where FT commentator Gideon Rachman said, where one of the questions was, over a third or something of Japanese businesses still get their profits from China, from either producing there or selling to China. A lot of students at universities in Tokyo are still Chinese citizens. That sounded somehow like that was a proof that there's still a lot of people-to-people engagement, even though, as Yuki said, people get a bit nervous to go to China, or from the Chinese side, the Chinese government makes it more difficult for Chinese to go abroad to Japan or anywhere else. What was your takeaway from the conversation, Serena?
We also asked this question to Sasha Gabuev quite a while ago. It's just the one answer to go to if you want to keep engaging. It's not just staying at a government level, but having people actually engage And it's also what Yuki said, right? Avoiding the controversial topics is the way to go to continue the relation.
Japan is doubling its defense budget, and of course, the Japanese taxpayers have to pay for that, so they have to ultimately support that policy of the government. Here, especially in Western Europe, we're sometimes being accused of having been too naive towards the risks that Russia has been posing to the security here. I didn't get a feeling from Yuki that the Japanese are as naive as we perhaps were a couple of years ago concerning the risks that they are seeing coming from Russia, from China, from North Korea. They're in quite a tight spot there. What are your thoughts on that, Manuela?
Yeah, of course, geographically, Japan sits much, much closer sort of to these actors than perhaps we are, with the exception of Russia. I found it quite interesting. So there is these surveys that are done annually about the perception of China in Japan. And these numbers keep sort of deteriorating. It's about a 90% of negative perception of China in Japan. But what is interesting is that younger people tend to have slightly more positive perspectives. And I thought that was quite interesting. So in a way, for continuing people-to-people engagement and with students and exchanges, at least for the younger generation, that sort of gives some openness. In the reports where they mentioned this growing negative perception of China in Japan, in one of these reports also was the question about the importance of bilateral engagement. Luckily, a majority still think that this kind of bilateral engagement is very important. But this percentage is also diminishing. And it is also interesting because there might be a bit of a case for a reduced internal or national political incentive. Because when you have Prime Minister Kishida receiving criticism from sort of more conservative wings, tagging him as a bit too China-friendly, that of course reduces the national political will, so to speak, from Japan to promote this bilateral engagement. And perhaps it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where interests gets lowered, engagement gets lowered, and when engagement is less, the interest is also less. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. There is always also internal actions and currents that influence these things. This interplay that then ends up generating the big currents, right?
And she said there were no protests this time around, right? But I think I remember I read a few stories from Okinawa, just at the places where all the US military bases are.
Yes, Okinawa feels that very differently, of course, because if the population in Tokyo sort of talks about a closer engagement with the US, for example, or stock up of bases, for them it's very much something that is very far away, and the population of Okinawa clearly lives and sees that. And there has been also known to be issues sort of that living together with those synergies on Okinawa between military bases and population on different fronts. So it's understandable that the reaction there is different.
Manuela, you spent a lot of time in Japan. How did you perceive the attachment that Yuki also describes that Japanese have still towards that pacifistic character of their constitution?
I remember having conversation with a fellow student about this, a Japanese student, when I was there on exchange. And I always found it quite interesting. I mean, in a way, Japan has an army, it's the self-defense force, and has very clear focuses. But this idea of a peaceful nation, of a non-violent action or reaction was then very present. But perception have been shifting. In 2015, when the constitution was sort of interpreted a little bit differently, perceptions have been shifting, and public opinion towards it has either become more acceptant or sort of gone with it, which is kind of exemplified what Yuki says, right? There was no big protests this time when the defense budget raise was announced. So I think there are changes that are happening, and of course this is due to the situation and to the environment and to the actions of other actors of China and of other nations. The people, of course, see.
I think it's maybe also worthwhile to take a longer look than just to the pacifist constitution that was installed by the US and its allies after World War II. But of course, Japan has the history of being aggressor also in the region. But what I found mostly underreported is how much Japan has done since then, also in the region. Like economically or development help in Southeast Asia, even at the height of BRI investments, Japan was outspending China by a lot. In Southeast Asia, Japan is perceived as a friendly actor in that terms. I'm just wondering if it's also underreported that Japan is a middle power, because it might just be a big power. It's still economically the third largest country in the world.
There might be strength in what you mentioned, right? So Yuki also makes this point of sort of Japan becoming an anchor that kind of unite. When the US pulled out of TPP, Japan becoming this anchor that sort of united all the regional actors together. Maybe almost surprisingly, but then again, maybe not so much, as you said. They have quite a positive presence in many Southeast Asian countries.
And also, I have confidence in them if Trump returns that they will pull off something like CPTPP when Trump was around for the first time, like getting that economic agreement on track again, that they would do something along that lines, maybe in defense.
That's something that to me stands out a lot, sort of this role of Japan as the America whisperer a little bit in the region, sort of being this point of contact, close ally to the US, which is both a crux and a blessing that they have to deal with, but at the same time becoming this point of contact between the US and other actors in the region. And I think that's quite an important role that they have played and continue to play.
That's all for this episode of State of Asia. If you want to dive deeper into Japan's position in the world, my colleagues at Asia Society Japan Center in Tokyo spoke with Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator at the Financial Times, about the choices, challenges and risks facing Japan's foreign policy. Gideon shares valuable, if not sobering, insights from his months spent in Tokyo. It's a very interesting conversation. A link is in the show notes. The next episode of State of Asia features a conversation with Alicia Garcia Herrero, Hong Kong-based chief economist for Asia Pacific at French investment bank Natixis. Subscribe to not miss out on that and all future episodes. On our website asiasociety.org/Switzerland, you'll always find all information on the many events and activities we organize. That's also where you'll find a link to sign up for our weekly newsletter, find out how to become a member and other ways to support us. My name is Remco Tanus. Thanks for listening.